So the first piece of our analysis was really just to understand who's using transit and how transit patronage itself has changed over the past 15 or 16 years. Next slide. So what we did, long story short, we used a bunch of survey data to sort of look at how people travel around in the region and how that's changed over time. And what we found is that people with no driver's license use transit a lot more than people who do have their driver's license. African Americans tend to use transit more than people who are not African American. People in households without cars, maybe unsurprisingly, use transit a lot more than people in households with cars. Okay, and people in households in which there are more drivers than cars tend to use transit more than people who live in households in which there's at least one car per driver. Yay, it's back. And recent immigrants tend to use transit more than people who are either non-immigrants or immigrants who have been here longer. And none of this is particularly surprising, but it is pretty representative of who the transit dependents and heavy transit users are in the region. And then the second piece of our analysis was, now the kind of understanding of who uses transit and how transit use has been changing, was to sort of look at, okay, well, what's actually causing all of this? Next slide. So we examined 6 major factors, and we found it sort of analytically useful to divide these into 2 categories, those being factors that transit operators can control and factors that transit operators cannot control. In factors that transit operators can control, we looked at the quantity and quality of transit service, as well as transit fares. And in the category of factors that transit operators cannot control, we looked at fuel prices, transportation network companies, or TNCs, such as Lyft and Uber, neighborhood change and migration, and finally, rising vehicle ownership. The pool of transit users is changing. Essentially what we're seeing is there are just fewer numbers of people are what we call transit dependents, who faithful transit riders who are captive and they use transit a lot. And what we're seeing for various reasons are that we have more choice riders, or people who do have other mobility options. And there's not a lot of reason to think that this itself is going to reverse anytime soon. There are some trends to fuel prices that are more variable, but again, vehicle ownership itself seems to be on the rise. And so given these factors, one possible path forward is to sort of focus on broadening the base of occasional transit users. SCAG region lost 72 million riders annually from 2012 to 2016. That's a lot, but there are 18 million people in the region. And we know that 72% of those 18 million, so about 14.5 million, never or basically never ride transit. So if we can get 1 out of every 4 of these people to replace one driving trip with a transit trip once every 2 weeks, that's 96 million annual passengers every year, which would more than compensate for this declining ridership. And with that, I'm done.
The Redlands Passenger Rail Project, for those who haven't heard, is a 9-mile long project. We're completely reconstructing a partially abandoned freight line. The property, the actual freight corridor, was bought in 1992 as part of the larger Metrolink system that was purchased. And it was always envisioned that Metrolink would go all the way to Redlands, the Redlands Passenger Rail Project. We're going to have 5 stations to start off with. One is the transit center just down the street, and we're doing retrofit there for these different vehicles of the existing platforms. And we have the Tippett Canoe Station and the downtown, or New York Street Station, which is completely privately funded by Esri. Then we have the downtown Redlands Station, and last at the end of the line we have the University Station. We will be crossing 26 roadways as we go to build this project. We are doing infrastructure improvements at all of them, tearing out all the track, rebuilding it all, putting in new signals, gates, pedestrian gates, and a lot of infrastructure. So one of the biggest challenges with this project is managing the reconstruction of all those grade crossings. Because if you can imagine, some of those roads like Waterman, Alabama, some of them are major arterials. And then we will be rehabilitating 4 bridges, 3, and reconstructing 1. Some of the key components of the project: 1 is quiet zones. So right now Metrolink does not exist with quiet zones in most places except Orange County, who did a follow-on project. So we will be implementing, building the infrastructure necessary to implement quiet zones. So positive train control. So positive train control is a system by which the trains in the signal system talk independently to one another and reduces your reliability on the operator. In the state of California, we have what's called the Transit Development Act funding, and that provides two sources of funds. It's a sales tax at the state level that's returned to source to our county based on population. And so local transportation fund is our primary source to fund operations aside from fare revenues. We have very limited sources beyond that.
But our riders are young, they're very balanced in terms of gender, very ethnically diverse, and low income. They are employed, but lower income employed. And I'm going to talk a little bit about our Go Smart program. We do have 38% students, and one of the things that we're doing in cooperation with the local schools is the schools are fully subsidizing transit trips for their students. And Hannah mentioned this also in her experience as a student taking transit, and I do think that that's one of the things that we're doing that's very positive to plan for the future and sort of plant the seeds for transit use in the future. In our plan this year, we have 5 strategic initiatives, and they're not necessarily in importance of order here, but I'm going to just touch briefly on them to give you an idea of, as an operator in the transit environment, the things that we're doing as we try to address some of the trends we see, as we try to adapt to the changing needs of the customers. In terms of financial stability and operating cost efficiencies, Carrie did a great job laying the framework for this. We published a white paper to our board of directors earlier this year that essentially outlined the same issues that Carrie brought up, the flat funding from our main local revenue source, well, state revenue source. And with that, there just really isn't growth predicted in the future. So how do we address that in terms of operating efficiencies? And we need to make sure that the service that we're providing is provided in the most cost-effective manner. Service expansion and growth. This one really, the projects that fall below this in our plan really have a lot to do for preparing the agency for the start of the Aero service, analyzing what connections we'll need to stations, and then of course looking for additional funding opportunities. In terms of technology for our organization, we have some big challenges in terms of mandated items that we have to address in the coming years. Has everyone in the room heard of the zero emission bus rule and that's coming from the state? So there is a requirement that in the very near future, the date is a little left uncertain at this point, but transit operators will have to transition to completely electric buses, which obviously just from a financial standpoint is a significant concern for us, also from an infrastructure standpoint, from a real estate standpoint. So we're working through some of the planning in partner with SBCTA to develop our plans to address that. And then the other big requirement that we have under the technology is we're required to submit a transit asset management plan, which is a requirement from the FTA relative to your state of good repair of all your assets. So we're also going through that project. So a lot of resources, financial and staffing wise, go to those things. Safety and security. This really is about the public perception of the system and making sure we're doing everything we can do to keep our current customers safe and secure on our vehicles and at our facilities. Again, and then workforce stability. 2 things I would point out here. First is we had an estimate that 80% of our senior leadership team will retire within the next 5 years. So this is staggering for us. So we're in the process right now of working with an executive recruiter to hire an operations director, a safety director, and a procurement director. piece here for us is we need to employ 430 bus operators to operate our service. And that is an ongoing, everyday struggle.
So we currently have more than 25 active transit partnerships all over the country. And I think there's a little bit of a misconception here about the relationship between ride sharing and transit. And Hannah's research, I think, pointed out, there may be a relationship where TNCs are driving down transit, but in many cases they have a lot more in common. So research has actually shown that people who use ride sharing, they drive less, they use transit more, and they're less likely to own a car. And ultimately, that's part of our mission, is to reduce the need for car ownership, which I think is probably a little bit of a theme for today. So as a result, a lot of transit agencies see us as a potential partner to be able not only to lower their costs, but also to serve their passengers in a way that's more convenient for them. So what we found is there are some specific use cases like this where rideshare can play a role, not only in reducing costs, but also having better service levels. And I wish I could talk about each of these in depth and give you specific examples, but just for the sake of today, here are some of the most common partnerships that we've seen in these 25 partnerships that we have across the country. We all sort of agree probably, but raise your hand afterwards if you disagree, that multimodal is really the future here. And I think the other thing that I want to stress is that technology for us is not a silver bullet. So we rely on these community partnerships, we rely on government partnerships to really shape the neighborhoods to what we want to see for them. And we understand that Lyft is just one single part of that. So